The symposium seeks to explore piggybacking practices in relation to contemporary forms of inequality in the built environment. Broadly speaking, what are piggybacking practices? Merriam-Webster offers us three related definitions of piggybacking in verb form. One, to carry up on the shoulders and back, as in a piggyback ride. Two, to transport one vehicle on another, as in piggyback transport. In these first two definitions, piggybacking involves a literal carrying, an assist, leveraging one actor's capabilities to extend the performance of another. The space shuttle, for example, as an unpowered glider, requires a lift from a modified 747 to travel from its landing site in California back to Cape Canaveral in Florida. Might we also extend these definitions to architectural examples? In that regard, the third definition is more instructive. To piggyback also means to exploit an existing system, resource, or product, to set up or cause to function in conjunction with something larger, more important, or already in existence or operation. This begins to suggest hybrid programs and networked relations, where one actor's availabilities align with another's needs, akin to certain forms of cross-species entanglement. We can see similar phenomena in the built environment. Diverse actors forging surprising alliances as they negotiate access to space, resources, and opportunities in crowded cities. These, in short, are piggybacking practices, asymmetrical, multi-use propositions for anchoring socially or economically marginal activities alongside dominant ones. These practices are best described by example: rooftop agriculture, market rate condominiums with basement artist residencies, and student senior home shares are just a few. Just a few of the 21 case studies forming the basis of the online exhibition that accompanies the symposium. The exhibit and the symposium are part of an ongoing research project seeking to answer the following questions. To what contemporary cultural and economic pressures are these piggybacking practices responding? Who are the agents? That is, who are the piggybackers? Who are the piggybackees? And what kinds of tactics do they utilize? Note that the case study drawings are illustrated with two colors to reveal the spatial particularities of these unique entanglements. Tactically speaking, piggybacking is an inherently opportunistic endeavor and is often born of necessity. Piggybacking practices have become increasingly common in the years following the economic recession of 2008. This suggests they are, at least in part, a response to the intensifying pressures of contemporary market logics. They are emerging alongside widespread increases in social and economic inequality. Often lacking the necessary capital or land to build in a traditional manner, piggybacking practitioners operate tactically within the space of the other. They scan the urban landscape looking for opportunities in vacancy, waste, and un- or underexploited niches. These opportunities may be spatial, that is, existing in, on, or in between buildings and sites, but they may also be temporal, existing within the daily, weekly, seasonal, or one-time gaps between use and non-use. In examining the wide range of case studies that make up the piggybacking practices exhibition, a common set of tactics becomes evident. The research suggests that in order to offset one program's disadvantaged position in relation to other, more traditional and more fully capitalized forms of urban development, piggybackers employ one or more of the following tactics: niche inhabitation, leveraging residual spaces on the top row; resource sharing and use multiplication, promoting hybridity on the middle row; or reuse, capturing waste streams. The nature of any given piggybacking exchange differs greatly depending on which of these tactics is employed. And it's important to note that these are not discrete categories. Indeed, one or several of these tactics may be found in any given project. But this initial research also points to larger questions, which are crucial ones for us as designers, planners, and advocates working in the built environment, and which I hope we might consider over the course of this symposium. To what ends are these piggybacking tactics typically deployed? In other words, for what larger strategic aims might they prove useful? When, if ever, are these tactics alone sufficient to achieve these larger strategic aims? And what other practices might they be paired with in pursuit of broader goals, like the expansion of access and opportunity in the built environment? So again, thank you all for joining us for session 1, Tactics and Strategies. We do hope you'll join us again next Monday at the same time for session 2, Ethics and Sensibilities.
Can I just ask if everybody's seeing a screen? It's like a ship.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to Brian and the Fay Jones School community. We're so excited to be here tonight and to have the opportunity to share our work with you and have this conversation with so many colleagues that we really admire. I'm Marie-Laud Adams, and this is Dan Adams. We run Landing Studio based in Somerville, Massachusetts. You're only going to hear from us tonight, but the work that we're showing really depends on a team of people, a couple of whom are in the audience tonight, Ryan Gagneman and Gavin Zeitz, as well as Isabella Greco. What you're seeing in the image here is a photo of the deck of a Panamax ship where a couple of crew members are playing basketball at the ship's emergency muster point. Okay. So tonight we're going to share 3 projects in chronological order. All of these utilize piggybacking, and we're going to try to trace some learning for us across the projects in terms of developing more or less durable piggybacking relationships, to borrow a word from Brian's work. What we do is to help make public places that are not very public more public. This relates to the fact that all of this work that we'll be sharing is primarily in industrial and infrastructural environments, places that are in theory about the public good, but don't necessarily provide public access. So the way that we're going to talk about this will be structured the same over each of the 3 projects. We'll start by talking about the context, or how we think about the state of publicness at the start of each of these projects. The piggybacking is, in every case, a public access landscape. We're going to use the term park loosely throughout the project, throughout the presentation, as a shorthand for public realm in this presentation. Tactics are, in each of the projects, leveraging infrastructural systems to serve the public realm. And then we'll look at design artifacts. So what are the physical elements, drawings, policies that allow for the public realm to emerge in these places? And then finally, what are the practices, programs, and processes? As some of these projects are beyond their construction phase, we're going to look back at them with a different perspective and see how some of these things have emerged as outcomes.
So the first project we're going to talk about is what's often known as the Salt Pile, which is located just north of Boston, Massachusetts. I think this notion of publicness is particularly interesting here. This is a private company and privately owned salt, and yet, of course, this has traveled the world over federal navigation channels. This is distributed almost solely to public Department of Works and highway departments. In this case, this is coming from the Atacama Desert in Chile. It's located in a really complex environmental justice community. I would call it a severe environmental justice community. It's one of the smallest municipalities in Massachusetts. It's under 2 square miles, and yet receives about 75% of Massachusetts petroleum product, as well as the vast majority of our salt product. You can see here, there's this sort of almost like competing hourglasses between 50% of the city being industrial and about 50% being high density residential, many living below the poverty line, many very recent immigrants to the city. And that sort of industrial density manifests itself particularly on the waterfront in a complex public circumstance where industry is really a barrier to the public resource of the waterfront. Here, what you see is the sort of territory of the project that we're going to show, which is essentially a salt dock expanding into a former asphalt batching and jet fuel distribution terminal. Marie cautioned me not to spend much time on this slide. It's the kind of slide you can spend a lot of hours on. The genesis of the project in many ways is a series of contradictions between regulations here at the local level, state level, and federal level. At the local scale, it's really a sort of restriction caused by the city's own response to industry, which is to try and prohibit future industrial development. They were so burdened by industry, they crafted a zoning code to prevent industry, which on the other hand directly contradicted state regulations, which essentially require that only industrial development is created here. And then you just laminate in the sort of contemporary challenges of federal regulations like Homeland Security that essentially make these sites entirely inaccessible to anyone who doesn't have security clearances. The project, what we call the piggybacking, is really the design of a shared use landscape where we try to negotiate public access into active industrial salt operations. And you can see on the top there a series of sort of photos that give a bit of the sort of flavor of the project. There were a few sort of just like tactics that let's say approaches that we should identify to just understand the project. One being the kind of recycling of industrial elements, which sort of followed the demolition of the terminal. Again, this was at the time, mothballed asphalt batching and jet fuel terminal. So different components of that site essentially getting reallocated. You can even see here things like the bulkhead of the former oil terminal becomes repurposed as infrastructure for mooring now the salt vessels. You can see the construction of like headquarters building and the salt stockpiles. And in particular, the kinds of environments that I think Brian focused on and wrote about here were the integration of public realm into this theoretically public landscape. The waterfront here has all got a complex history of being urban fill. It was an ocean taking, ocean being part of the public trust and public domain of this country. Even the very land that this is situated on is considered part of a sort of national trust. And yet it was entirely inaccessible to the local community. So while it might be like nationally public, it was very locally restricted. So how could we start to develop sort of public landscapes in this environment that serve the local community while simultaneously serving the broader regional and national interests? So I think one of the first tactics that we really identified in many ways working through the regulatory agencies was how to design the park essentially as industry and shape it by the functions of the industrial landscape. So we produced sort of between state and federal agencies a number of drawings that basically tried to diminish the park in the eyes of those regulators to say, no, it's not at all a park. This is actually park. It's sort of a series of infrastructural moves that add up to form a park. So you can see things like creating clearances at the waterfront, the bollard zones. You can see things like the red zone through the middle of the property is actually a utility easement that was turned into vehicle access to the waterfront. So essentially arguing that through the regulatory domains, you can see here, that's actually Marie in the middle of the photo standing on the sort of bollard clear zone. And it's just sort of shaping it to function as a park, though its technical definition is a bollard clear zone. The other kind of tactics that we looked at is often industry is just sort of generically referred to as just that. It's referred to as industry, sort of ignoring all the particularities. And that was something I really appreciated in Claire's presentation is that Claire doesn't do that. The salt pile has a very specific set of parameters, some of which can be capitalized on. So the salt in New England is used to de-ice roadways. So it's very active in the winter months. On the other hand, outdoor parks around here are a little less used in the winter and a lot more used in the summer. So it creates a nice sort of seasonal tactic. And part of the design was to allocate an area here, which from sort of federal and state regulators' perspective, still served its industrial function, but could be, let's say, softly treated with lightweight infrastructure to sort of condition it for public uses when it's not being used by industry. So here you see what's now become really an annual tradition where in fact the only waterfront park basketball court is annually covered with salt. And then in the spring, it is annually reconstructed, through a series of what we call design artifacts, which are movable fences and simple pavement markings. And I should comment that this sort of, I'd say, piggybacking tactical approach is really the first time that a public park has been added to the public realm, certainly of the waterfront in Chelsea for about 100 years. it was sort of the first opportunity to crack public space into the industrial waterfront. Some of the other artifacts that we've really sort of focused on in our work is realizing that there's sort of like physical artifact or physical tactics in the site, but there are also a series of artifacts that often have to negotiate the more regulatory or policy-based domain. A common device we've worked through is sort of these various forms of contracts that regulate the relationship. In this case, a memorandum of agreement between the city and the industry, which really outlines almost outside of the realm of conventional zoning types of relationships that can govern the complex ecosystem between industry and the city. So in this case, the memorandum of agreement outlines certain things like even salt stockpiling strategies, both to open the site for access for the city, but also to preserve views, particularly in summer months. Another sort of tactic that we have, I think, sort of learned through the process of these projects is to really translate not just the physical space or the regulatory domain of these industries, but actually the working operations of the industry themselves, and in some ways the workforce and the skill sets. So in this case, obviously, a salt dock has a ton of useful equipment and high capacity equipment, as well as very knowledgeable and capable labor. In this case, you can see they are incredibly good at building piles. So in many ways, the even design of the landscape was to translate those skills to shaping a more recreation and public facing environment. So here you see one of our dock managers essentially spending their summer months building a park as opposed to their winter months building a salt pile. I should say from a sort of a labor consistency perspective, this is also, I think, a fantastic gain because often these terminals don't employ so many people in the summer months. It creates a longer term employment strategy. An outcome of that is even a sort of a modification to typical drawing standards. We often find working in this way, we have to move away from conventional drawing sets and into more of an SK model of continuous sketches. I think I'll quickly wrap up this project by saying, I think working in this way of truly embedding industrial operations with the public domain has of course led to all sorts of ongoing, what we call sort of outcomes. As part of that park development, we had, for example, built an amphitheater in a former oil tank farm. It obviously wasn't long before the kind of theater companies working there started seeing the salt pile itself as a resource. And again, the kind of workforce capacity of the labor force and their seasonality made it possible to start using the salt itself for sort of theater construction. So now an annual tradition of the salt company is to build stage sets for the theater production company. That then naturally spins off all sorts of new partnerships. In this case, a couple of years ago, we had to do a very robust electrical infrastructure installation in this public park feeding off of the docks infrastructure. That supports all sorts of events now, but I think even most recently, very interestingly, when the city of Chelsea was trying to figure out where to set up their food distribution hubs, where could they get power for all the refrigeration units, the sort of simple infrastructure in the park, as well as the kind of the reconceptualization of that industrial area as a public space, open that terminal for that use to distribute food to the city. I think most interestingly to us, the most recent sort of outcome has been a sort of a shift, in fact, in the city of Chelsea, particularly as they look at their future of trying to maybe limit the kind of rampant gentrification that's happening in this area by maybe sort of reconsidering the future of industry in their city. And I think very sort of symbolic to us is the change in their zoning code from essentially industry being an excluded use to now being, you can see, from N to SP, a special permitted use, meaning that they are willing to bring industry to the table and negotiate it as a positive neighbor as long as it can be negotiated in the city.
So the second project is I-93 InfraSpace, and this project, this is the site, how it looked when we began it. It's a major highway interchange in South Boston as a byproduct of the Big Dig project. The context and the conditions of publicness here, there's severe neighborhood fragmentation that occurs as a result of this interchange being located where it is. No trespassing. The state transportation agency who controlled the land underneath the interchange, their solution of prohibiting access to the space was not working. The area became known both for legal and illegal dumping as well as physical violence. And then environmental degradation. The area is almost entirely impervious. All of the stormwater is untreated, flowing directly to local waterways and the Boston Harbor. And of course, there's enormous, urban heat island potential here. All of this is really very common to highway sites everywhere. There's almost nothing remarkable about it at all. The piggybacking tactic or project here is that the DOT adds a park under the highway. So the park here involves stormwater management landscape that treats the runoff from the highway before it enters the harbor, shared use pathways that connect the neighborhoods together, flexible recreation and event spaces, and a street art gallery. The main tactics in this project are very similar to the first project, to design the park here as transportation infrastructure. This arose out of the particular conditions of the project. The client or the proponent of the project was the state transportation agency. This is a project where there was no benevolent billionaire donor. There was no private foundation in the picture to build the park like there is with many other highway park projects. So departments of transportation, of course, can build, operate, and maintain transportation infrastructure. They typically have relatively large budgets to do this work, but they cannot build parks. That's not within their budget policies. So the project became how to take what they can do to build, operate, and maintain infrastructure to build a park out of that mission. In other words, how can a park be made of pathways, green stormwater infrastructure, and landscape buffers? So we start with the first kind of design artifact, which is the pathways, the transportation infrastructure, connecting across neighborhoods with shared use pathways, faster pathways for commuting, and then slower, more meandering pathways that bring access for people to the stormwater landscape. The second kind of major design artifact here was to reroute the pipes. So how to create a landscape out of green infrastructure. So you look at all the catchment areas. The highway itself is basically a very enormous catchment area for stormwater drainage. Typically it goes into an underground network of pipes and then discharges directly into the waterways. We disconnected the pipes through the project, which is what you're seeing here, and then rerouted those into the landscape to create a drainage surface. The second design artifact is the maintenance pads. So sizing and distributing paved areas throughout the stormwater landscape to support maintenance equipment access. So these are basically areas where boom lifts can be located in order to support inspection of the concrete infrastructure and to do repair work. These are areas that can also double function as recreation spaces that are placed throughout the stormwater landscape. Let's see here. In this case, another kind of important piece of the project for the post-construction life of it was a lease agreement, which is a way of bringing in a private partner to the park, and also a tool to activate the space and bring in elements that the DOT itself could not implement within their budget and policies. So this enabled a private partner to put on events to help activate the space, as well as pre-vetted mural opportunities for the infrastructure. And some of the outcomes were that this became a kind of constantly growing street art gallery that's curated by an artist-owned organization and featuring local artists. And another outcome that's really interesting about this is new standards within the transportation agency. So working within the structure of a transportation agency that's constantly building, maintaining, repairing infrastructure, they essentially manage a huge living archive of specifications and construction details. So the opportunity in this project was to, once a standard detail is developed and approved for one project, it can be adopted into this archive and used on other projects. So we didn't talk about this piece of it very much, but we're always kind of proud of the fact that we got a new spec into the DOT system called the dinosaurs for one piece of the project that was a new kind of lighting scaffold that you see here. And then the last project that I'll talk about is still in a design phase right now. I'll start again with the kind of phases of the state of publicness on the site. So this is in Boston, the gateway to the historic Emerald Necklace, Olmsted's kind of famous park system. It's also the missing link in Boston's regional park network, where the Emerald Necklace connects in with the Charles River Reservation and the Esplanade. These two park systems are in fact not linked together. It's impossible to walk from one to the other because of highway era urban renewal projects. You can see on the right-hand picture there a photo of the construction phase when an overpass was built directly over the park system, severing the link between those two areas. Another kind of context point of this project is that a bridge in the area that is creating this disconnect between the two landscapes is at the end of its service life. And then finally, all of the roadway projects disconnect Boston's river ecosystems. You can see in the picture, the way that the Muddy River now interchanges with the Charles River is through a series of 4 concrete pipes. So in this project, in a way to differentiate from the last one, where the DOT simply adds a park under an existing highway, the difference here is that the transportation project is to replan the whole area to prioritize non-vehicular connectivity, park networks, and ecosystem connectivity. And the key tactic in the project is that it started with a grassroots community-led effort. So this is where residents banded together with water quality advocates, open space advocates, transportation advocates to develop a plan through a year-long visioning process, which led to getting the attention of the state transportation agency, who needed to replace this roadway infrastructure as it was nearing the end of its life cycle. The transportation agency adopted the design and our team in this project. And then the second really important tactic here that unlocked the potential to create new connectivity is, due to the bridge engineer on the project, who really wanted to rethink construction staging. So typically a project like this would involve the construction of a temporary bridge to divert traffic and avoid shutting down roads during construction. The idea here is that for the same price, a temporary bridge can be made permanent. This allows for lifting both of the roadways up and the opportunity to daylight the river and reconnect the park systems. The other tactics I won't go into because they're basically exactly the same as the last project that I showed, bringing in green stormwater infrastructure as sort of a public realm landscape amenity, designing for maintenance access as a way to produce recreation spaces and event spaces. And then in the outcomes of this project, we find that, this is an example where the public sector is actually funding public realm project for the most part. The original proposed bridge replacement project was a $35 million roadway structure replacement project. That grew into a $75 million project that involved not only the bridge structure replacement, but also habitat restoration, flood mitigation, the multimodal corridor connections, and green infrastructure. And so we just want to close by sharing a few different reflections on the projects. Some of the things that come to mind are the difference between planning and inserting, just between those last 2 projects, planning new infrastructure in concert with the public realm versus bringing the public realm into an existing infrastructure space, and what are the different kinds of outcomes that come from that. Community-led practices versus infrastructure-led, and then the iterative versus discrete design action. So what are the times when an architect is able to be involved from the planning stages all the way through the ongoing life cycle of the place, and how that can kind of inform the durability of the piggybacking relationship. And that's all we have. Thank you.